Welcome to the Asia Roundtable of the Global UAE Energy Forum, where we are going to use this digital stage to brainstorm answers to a critical question. What policies must be put in place in 2021 to accelerate net zero ambitions? Recent months have seen game changers in the climate space for Asia, notably China committing to net zero by 2060, Japan and South Korea with 2050. And many, many other major steps. But this is a huge space. It's home to 48 nations and a staggering 4.5 billion people, 60% of the global population. So within that picture, clearly one size is not going to fit all. There needs to be a multitude of solutions to get to that decarbonisation status of net zero. With that in mind, we have esteemed speakers with us today who will hopefully give us a better shot at some clarity, no pressure. Let's kick off with each speaker having a couple of minutes for their thoughts on the critical question, and then we will delve in deeper. It's a lot to squeeze into 45 minutes, but we're certainly going to try. So please may we start with Dr. Yanadi, a Senior Officer of Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency at the ASEAN Centre for Energy, also known as ACE. Your thoughts in brief, please.
First of all, thank you very much for the honor to be participating in this roundtable sessions. So, Zulfikar, just brief to explain, from ASEAN Center for Energy, which is the intergovernmental organizations which handles the energy sector interests of the 10 ASEAN member states. And from our institution, we have several roles like think tank and knowledge hub and also catalyst. And through that roles, we have been doing a lot of research and cooperation activities in pursuing these energy transitions. And what we have been observed is that during this COVID-19 pandemic, very strong impacts to the energy sectors, not only in the oil and gas sector, but also in renewable and electricity. And moving forward, we are guided by the Energy Cooperation Blueprint, the APAEC, and we also just released the ASEAN Energy Outlook last year's in the ASEAN Ministers Energy Meeting, and we keep cautiously optimistic. So we realized that impacts in GDP and also in the economic activity and energy demand, which slowed down the energy activities in 2020, and we expect it will still roll out in 2021. But we do hope that with the rollout of vaccines, with new normal activities and others, 2021 can be better than the previous year, and hopefully it can lead to a green recovery moving forward, especially since we as a region has a specific target in 2025 to reach 23% of renewable energy share in the TPES, and also another target in reducing energy intensity. So that's a brief comment from me. Thank you very much.
And in terms of your hopes for this year, I think we all join you on those, certainly. Next up, I'd like to welcome Mona Lisa de Malanta, Chair of the National Renewable Energy Board in the Philippines. What are your thoughts, please, Mona Lisa?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon from Manila. Just an introduction as well on the Philippine National Renewable Energy Board. We are a board that was created under the Renewable Energy Act in 2008 here in the Philippines, and we act as an advisory body to the Department of Energy, the Energy Regulatory Commission, and the various stakeholders here in the Philippines. I think I joined the I like what Dr. Yunadi said about cautious optimism. We share that optimism, but maybe would like to move the needle a bit more on the side of optimism in the area of renewable energy, maybe for the Philippines, because we definitely have seen clearer signs that at least on the national level, there is a clearer indication that we are moving towards more aggressive targets on renewable energy. So we can afford to be more optimistic, I think, for the Philippines. Maybe on the clear question for the panel for this afternoon, maybe two things that I can share is that one, we need more policies that will support private sector investment on the renewable energy side. At least for the Philippines, we have a deregulated energy market. So it's really relying on private sector investment. So what government needs to do is to allow private sectors, all those funds that are now shifting from fossil fuel investments, so that they would go to renewable energy projects. So that's one. The second is maybe aside from preparing that environment that would be more conducive to private sector, looking at the grid infrastructure in the Philippines, and I know maybe also true for Indonesia, where we have a lot of islands that are not connected to the main grid. We need to address that situation of energy accessibility still for the islands that are connected. It's something that has been a long-standing problem, I think, in the Philippines, or long-standing situation. And RE, with the advent of advanced technology in renewables, I think we now have that opportunity to really address the issue of access by having smaller sized units housed or embedded in the islands, and it will address this situation. So very excited for renewable energy, not just in 2021, but for the rest of the decade, I think.
Well, we've certainly kicked off on a very positive note here, so that this
Yes.
is, let's see how we all feel by the end. I hope you still do.
Okay, thank you.
Let's bring in Henry Wang, please, International Author, Advisor and Speaker. He also recently joined the new International B20 Task Force. Henry, a few comments from you, please.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm very glad to speak to you all from Hong Kong here. I'm honored and humbled to be invited to join the G20, B20 International Task Force to advise the global leaders. We've been working for the last 12 months virtually because of COVID to prepare the new policy proposals on climate, sustainability and energy to the global leaders. We successfully submitted our policy recommendations to the G20 Global Leaders meeting in November, and we were glad to receive their endorsements. And really, the key area is really the global leaders endorsed our proposals that all countries around the world should work together to accelerate the energy transition and to move towards carbon neutrality. So we were very glad to hear some of the global leaders after their G20 meeting announcing increased targets for renewables and also accelerated move towards carbon neutrality. And like Michelle said, the China President Xi Jinping made a keynote speech to the UN announcing the new target for China to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060, which is very exciting and which I'm glad to be advising on. Thank you very much, and can discuss more during this webinar.
And perhaps what's something you just touched on there that we can discuss in more depth in a minute is about international cooperation or international partnerships as well. Moving on, Trung Ji, Head of Energy and Utilities Practice in Asia Pacific for Arthur D. Little. Trung, thank you for joining us. A few comments from you, please, before we crack on and get a little deeper.
Sure. Thanks, Michelle, and thanks everyone for allowing me to be part of this. Just a little bit on our firm and what we do here is we advise, consult with ministries, I guess pretty much any of the companies within the ecosystem, especially in the oil and gas, energy utilities is where I head up. Key topics has been through our clients, really not so much on the policies, but what is beyond the policies. We see a lot of countries and nations that bring out these policies, but how do we then implement it and invoke that into execution? We have also parts of the ecosystem that are kind of stuck in helping and supporting the rollout of various initiatives. For example, technology and digital is a good enabler. A lot of our clients are stuck at those areas where how do I then bring those technologies where I could be more carbon neutral? Are there incentives to help us to develop that further with policies and so forth? Now, I'm sure there are, but how do we make those ecosystems really support each other and collaborate? The other thing that I wanted to raise is again, some of the challenges that I've been advising our clients is in improving the talent pool. We do see global talent pools around, but locally we also need to educate and bring out the culture and then retain those talents. So talent attracts talent. And so once we have that, hopefully the ecosystem will thrive within that and then bring about further acceleration of the energy transition. We don't want another pandemic to be able to stop traveling and use less fuel. We want to try and still thrive with what we normally do. So hopefully all this will come together with this discussion and many more.
Excellent. Let's go on to a few more points, many of which have been raised, which is great, so we can delve in a little bit. Mona Lisa, I just want to get an overview, get a backdrop from you about how you would best describe the impact COVID-19 will have on Asia's climate policies for 2021. We saw some relatively positive twists and turns in 2020. How do you see this accelerating this year, or do you see this as a period of consolidation?
I definitely see it as continuing acceleration. Maybe a little bit of I wouldn't say slowing down, but a bit of reality check as people are getting to realize that this is the situation we are in is not going to go away anytime soon. So how do we deal with it? How do we really how do we integrate all these wonderful ideas, all these gains in terms of the climate efforts? How do we consolidate these gains? How do we solidify these gains? And as Trung said, make them from policies to reality. I think 2021 will see us confronting all those challenges. Definitely in the Philippines, that's where we are at. Transforming into actual those policies, transforming them to actual programs and to actual projects. So I think we'll see more of that, the realization from concept to actual projects.
And Dr. Yanadi, ASEAN, as you already mentioned, has set itself a target of meeting 23% of electricity usage through renewables by 2025, which is a very short 4 years away, especially when we consider those 4 years will also be economic recovery from COVID-19, hopefully. So has the pandemic slowed down progress towards this target, or is all still on track, do you think?
It definitely had some negative impacts, of course. So we at ACE actually follow the COVID-19 news impact to energy sector very closely, as we also published quarterly insights of COVID-19 impact to renewable energy, oil and gas, and also electricity. But we see that for renewable energy sector, at the beginning, there are a lot of projects that have been halted due to the pandemic. Some biofuel targets have been delayed because of that. But when you are moving to the Q3 and the Q4, we see that like some positive signals from the countries, like some of the renewable energy projects turn out to be more resilient compared to others, like they are continuing the process in it. And you might know that some countries even do the large-scale auction for solar PV, such as this in Malaysia, but also in Myanmar, successfully held during the pandemic. And same with Vietnam, who continues their development of solar. New FITs just released this last year as well, although they are planned to move out into another strategy, which is auction. So to sum it short, actually relatively compared to the non-renewables, we see the renewables to be slightly more resilient. But since the overall energy activities have been impacted, so the targets that we set for 2035 have been impacted as well. In our outlook, we set baseline scenarios, country target scenarios, and regional scenarios, and we see that still huge gap to be filled between the current level, even when we consider the national targets to be injected. And
but just, I mean, COVID has affected every country differently. The disparity is huge, absolutely huge. So within ASEAN, is there an element of some countries perhaps are more on track than they would have been? Perhaps they haven't been as badly affected by COVID-19, and actually they're more on track than than others now? Have there been any surprises that have emerged of countries doing better than you would have expected for 2021?
It's quite difficult to say for sure because the
I'll
thing
take
is,
that as a no.
yeah, it doesn't know because like some countries they do well at the beginning, but and then the COVID emergence, and then they have to shut down everything again. Lockdown happened in Malaysia again, in Indonesia, in the same. So again, it's still a year full of uncertainty, but some countries they are pushing forward with the policies. And just a quick note, also, I think 5 of the ASEAN member states submitted their NDCs. NDCs just 2020. Philippines is coming soon, I believe, and that's a good sign. So they keep put their commitment to update the NDC even during the pandemic. So positive signs. But again, I just want to say what Mona Lisa said and how to turn this planning, this idea of Build Back Better into real policies and real programs in the country.
Well, of course, the devil is in the details. Blueprints are one thing, but tangible projects are completely another. We've had blueprints for many ideas for decades, including the price on carbon, but actually making them a reality is a completely different story. And Trung, of course, this is something that you mentioned at the very beginning as well. And you talked about some trouble spots in terms of making this more of a reality. Digitalization is one of the aids that you touched on as well. If you had to pick 2 or 3 top trouble spots, top squeezes in the pipeline for making things a reality in Asia, and I know it's a huge region, which 3 would you pick?
That's a good question. There's quite a few, but if we were to look at top 3, it has to at least be the incentives for people to act on any of the policies that we develop and so forth. So far, it's just a paperweight unless we put some financial incentives to it, and you'll see that in the various markets. If you look at the S&P 500, for example, the oil and gas companies are not doing as well as those that are more greener or has initiatives within those space. Even the various market indicators show that anyone within the sustainability initiatives will do well. So if there are ways to incentivize the ecosystem to start this thing up, that would be the best way. That would be the first. The second is the cultural mindset shift. It's so difficult to steer away from what is already there and that I'm used to, especially when there's subsidies from the government that you cannot then go away from, right? So in Australia, for example, we're not even incentivizing folks to buy EVs, electric vehicles. In fact, we're going to get taxed even heavier. So how is that going to help anyone to pick up this? Whilst also other countries will have subsidies in petrol, for example. And so how are you going to then help to eliminate that usage? So the subsidies don't help, and the cultural change or that mindset will need to shift. And we saw that in 2020, whereby people are now shifting along that. And I see a lot of clients asking about how to change sector transformation. Then the third part I would say is you have a lot of next generation mindset as well that we need to start empowering. There's no longer people that will stay in one company that long or that they want to follow a boss or something. They want to have their own startup, their entrepreneurial mindset, they're risk takers. So how do we empower the next generation to take on this and create the next level of participants? So they'll be my top 3.
And as you just mentioned on the EV side as well, just for Australia as an example, do you see progress being made on that front this year? Do you see there being step changes with those financial incentives that you've touched upon? And indeed, the financial incentives then bleed over into the cultural change, and then therefore the empowerment begins. They're all very much interlinked. So do you see those sorts of policy changes being made this year after the momentum of 2020?
So I guess in short, just like Dr. Yunadi was saying, I'm not so sure. But in summary, I think there is going to be a gradual change. In fact, if you look at historically, how did China become 99% e-bus in Shenzhen and various other cities in southern China? They were invoked because policies were there and they were implemented through incentives. And then after that, after the 5-year period, those incentives die down until people start picking up the shift. If that could be done from various nations so that EV can be picked up or other renewable sources can be picked up, like in Europe, where you're pretty much neutrality, if not prosumer, where you give back to the grid, then that would be the way. So incentives will need to be there, but then you need to also weigh that down, just like we have for subsidies for petrol and so forth, right? So for 2021, I think it will slow, yeah.
It will...
It will pick up, but I don't, yeah.
Okay, so Henry, within this picture, global partnerships, cross-border partnerships as well are going to be, I imagine, quite critical. Do you see within, you've got a global perspective, do you see that increasing in Asia specifically? Do you see an increase in cross-border learning, cross-border knowledge sharing, cross-border talent to help accelerate the policies, many of which Trung has just mentioned, within Asia this year?
Thank you, Michelle. I think that's a very important question. And I think within Asia, I think it is very encouraging to see the leading countries or recently signing the regional cooperation, RCEP. I think that is a good foundation to promote further international collaboration between Asia and ASEAN countries. Let me give a few very good examples on this. I think there are, in terms of, in my recent book on renewable behind us, I think many Asian countries are already putting renewable growth and energy transition high up their policy agenda. I think China has certainly announced very ambitious renewable and energy transition targets to become one of the leading countries in the world with renewable power. But at the same time, like my other panelists said, Vietnam, Singapore, and other Asian countries and Philippines are also moving fast on this. And in this, I think there are many areas for cooperation. Let me give a few examples, which I recently touched on in different speeches around the world. One key area for carbon neutrality, the pathway towards carbon neutrality, is smart city design. And there are good cooperation between the different Asian countries on smart city. A good example is the cooperation between China and Singapore on smart city design, which could significantly reduce the amount of energy intensity in the cities as urbanizations goes up, accelerate, particularly in Asian countries. So hope that helps.
No, it certainly does. I mean, that's really beginning to add to the list that Trung and Mona Lisa and Dr. Yanadi as well are building up about these next steps that need to be put in place in the next 11 and a half months to really have meaningful change this year and to keep that momentum going. Mona Lisa, I'd just like to loop back to something that you were saying at the beginning to do with grids and the need for grid parity and the need for grid support, and that being a focus in the coming year for the Philippines and obviously further beyond that. What policies do you think specifically would help the Philippines get to that stage, Mona Lisa?
Definitely for the Philippines, we still have, for the main, we have 3 main islands. Only the 2 main islands are connected. There are programs. There's a long-term program for connecting the 3rd main island, Mindanao, but we don't we don't know when that will happen. And even if that happens, there are still smaller islands surrounding the main islands that are not viable for connection, for interconnection. So policies that would allow for, that will have a proactive grid planning is one thing that we have recommended to the regulator, that will allow the grid operator, the system operator, to do advanced planning and not wait for the projects to come in before they expand the network or upgrade the network. That's one. Second is to allow decentralized systems to come in. We still have I would say the policy on decentralized systems, or DERs, are still very much at the beginning stages, at the early stages. We still don't have a clear policy for it. The technology is definitely there, so, and demand for it is there. So we need to, and that's what I wanted. That's what I was saying earlier on policies that will really unlock markets. If for example, Trong had very good points on incentives, but we know that government coffers are not an ideal state at the moment, because of all the demand for COVID response. So if government cannot afford to extend incentives, then just allow markets to play out, and have that environment that will allow funds from the private sector to really go where they are needed. So that's where I would make that recommendation on the grid, and maybe the grid, and also at the, not just at the high voltage, but also at the low voltage system, the utilities that we have.
Mona Lisa, I apologize if this is a difficult question in advance, but just out of curiosity, that third island that you mentioned, what would roughly be the population of that island? Roughly.
Mindanao. I cannot give you the number at the moment, but we have of the three main islands, Luzon is the most populated. And the second most populated would be Mindanao, because in land area it's also bigger than the other island, Visayas. But the ones that are connected are Luzon and Visayas. Mindanao is bigger but not connected, more challenging to connect.
But we're talking tens of millions of people.
Oh yeah, yes, definitely.
Yeah, easily. So in that picture, tens of millions of people who are on a third main primary island, being disconnected to the neighboring two. Do you think there's incentive there in those stats alone for the government to allow greater private sector involvement this year? Do you think that the time has come where the government will go, you know what, the private sector can get involved, let's get moving,
Yes,
as you've
I think
discussed? Do you
so.
think this is the year?
Yeah, I think so. I think there have been efforts to really direct private sector interest in Mindanao, but it has its own set of issues as well, mainly peace and order situation and all that. So once there is now a special authority that was put up just a few years ago to focus on the development of Mindanao. So we're still hopeful, and even with that, with the fact that it's not connected to the main grid, there are a lot of RE projects that are initiated in the island. In fact, for the longest time, the main source of power in Mindanao is the hydropower facilities operated then by government. Now there is coal has really taken up a lot of the volumes in Mindanao, but there is still a huge promise for renewable energy in the island.
I think this is a really interesting test case of what it takes, as you say, to unlock. You were mentioning unlocking new markets and also unlocking that privatization and that push for privatization. It's a very interesting test case because all the reasons are there, and of course there are challenges. But as the pressure starts to build, the incentives will as well. Trung, just on this topic of the private sector and participation in Asia's decarbonisation journey, what do you see coming next? What role do you think regulators can play here in 2021?
Yeah, so when I was listening through Mona Lisa's discussion before on the regulation and the policies that they need to have, I was just going to say that when you open up the market, and we did the sector restructure for a Middle East country for the oil and gas sector, and we saw that there's different options for you to regulate markets or deregulate. And then when you do deregulate, there is going to be a lot of players that want to be part of this, but how do you make sure that it's done properly? And so there needs to be at least a governing body on top of that if you don't, be fully hands-on it and you allow markets to play that role. And then you have to make sure also the local development within the country, like Philippines, to be part of that. And so don't just consider taking a lot of foreign players to come in, although it's important. It's how you do it and participate within that so that you can flourish and sustainably do so. And so the way I see regulators going forward, if they do deregulate and the policymakers, will need to be ensuring that don't be too hands off, but don't also be too much in the operations that you don't allow the private sector to play a key role. And that was one of the biggest issues we saw in that Middle East country when we did the sector restructure, was that the ministry was too hands-on for it. Even recruiting people, headhunting and so forth were done up there, whilst then the markets cannot then play. And so it doesn't work that way. You either need to allow the market to flourish, manage it on the top somehow, and then make sure the local content or local development is there. But don't put too much pressure on the local development that you don't allow too little foreign players to then help and support, right? So that's how I kind of see that.
Balancing act, isn't it? It's a very delicate balancing act. Do you see, especially considering that we can't ignore COVID-19, of course, it's not part directly, well, in a way, it is part of the climate conversation. We've seen changes in the last year over our emissions, but we can't there'll be more recessions to come up to 2050. There'll be other major global challenges. And of course, the world can't stop and start now if we're to stick to this net zero challenge every single time one happens. But do you see what you've discussed there and finding that delicate balance? Is that a viable job that can be achieved in time to get the net zeros that we need by 2050? So obviously not by 2050, but to get the groundwork in place. Are the pieces of the puzzle there?
Yeah, so not really, in my view. This is almost a huge blip in our history that I don't think anyone really anticipated. So the way I see it is that we are now getting to, I hate to say it, but the new normal also. And so we need to try and anticipate what else is going to happen in the next 5 years. Now, we say that in Asia, we want to hit 24% as a target by 2025. Many of the nations within Southeast Asia are within the 2, 3, 4%. So to be able to do that to 2025 is actually a huge task. Now, what way is better to help all this is ensuring that the government allows infrastructure to be built. And if you look at historically, how did we recover from any disaster is through these infrastructure from the government to help build, whether it's roads or not. Renewables has proven that it's 2, 3, 4 times more job creation, job upskilling than your typical oil and gas or so forth. So by just doing renewables, bringing that initiative, accelerating it, you'll actually see yourself probably improving the economy, but also upskilling your local workforce and eventually being more greener and so forth.
Excellent. Dr. Yanadia, coal has been mentioned during this session, and the anti-coal rhetoric is rapidly intensifying globally and gradually in Asia as well. How much of an impact will this have on coal-related finance in 2021 in Asia, this anti-coal rhetoric? And do you see a dramatic decline? Do you see a gradual reduction lasting over the next couple of decades? What step change can we see coming up?
I think it's one of the sensitive, but issues to be discussed in terms of talking about the energy and also climate in Southeast Asia. Even in our outlook, we also predicted that until 2025, even 2040, fossil fuels still play a huge role in the energy sector in Southeast Asia. Coal in the power sector, but also petroleum products in transportation sector and also industry. So that's a big question that we have to solve. From ASEAN energy, from ACE perspective, we are trying to be neutral in technology-wise. So the countries are currently trying to embrace this energy transition, but trying to see what is the best way to do that Southeast Asian way, the so-called just energy transitions. And that brings a lot of countries in the region to implement clean coal technologies or HELIO technologies, high efficiency, low emission technologies. Like in Indonesia, the PLN, the state electricity utility, now put new regulation to limit the emission of their thermal power plants. But that will be not through direct changing from other fuel, but more to reducing the emission in the thermal power plants, because energy security issues are still there. But what I'm trying to, I mean, personally, what I'm thinking is that those kind of technologies are extra cost. And in a way, the renewable energy costs have been reduced. And bigger size of projects with the better environment, better human resources capacity, the price will be reduced. And there will be one point in the future that the selection between renewable and fossil fuels are not only based on environment issue, but also on economic issues. So,
well, we've reached that. We've reached that point, haven't we? Already,
yes,
for many renewable projects.
Exactly. And for some countries, it's a bit there, but it's not really translated in the Southeast Asia. There are many reasons. It's probably due to the subsidies of fossil fuels. It may be because of the enabling environment are not ready yet, but it's still not yet in the Southeast Asia, and we are eagerly waiting for that, and we are on the right way to that. But yeah, back to the questions with the coal financing, that is yet another factor that should push the countries towards the energy transition that we've been waiting for. And but specific note in here is that we are discussing about a net zero, in one of our main background background story is that the China, Korea, and Japan, they both set up the new the net zero policy, maybe 2050 or beyond that. But what we see in the Southeast Asian countries are that although the coal financing from the Europe, from the other countries have becomes more and more limited, but we can still see some financing coming from those three countries, from China, Japan, and Korea.
Exactly. I mean, China is one of the biggest financiers in coal in the world, isn't it?
Yes.
And
so
not just locally, but globally.
Exactly, yeah. And a lot of this money coming to Southeast Asia, and that brings the question on how their new intention of this net zero gonna their investment policy as well, because again currently I have to say that the coal industry are struggling due to this, and that's why they try to embrace this energy transition through low emission technologies. But, once as long as the demand is there, as long as the finance is there, it's still going to be there. So but
Dr. Yonadi, that actually links very well to our first survey question, which I'd like to just touch on now, if we can bring that up on the screen. It's quite a simple question, and there are only two answers. So just as you were touching upon, Dr. Yonadi, this is a critical question, the yes or no to this, really, and in that itself will bleed through into the coal market. So China, the world's biggest polluter and energy consumer, will achieve its net zero goal by 2060. Do you agree, or are you doubtful? We've had a very optimistic tone during this roundtable, though there have been moments of significant doubt. So I'm not sure what the answer is going to be. If you've all voted, if we can see the answers, please. Ah, fantastic. Right. That's an optimistic tone. Nearly 2/3 think yes, China will hit its goal by 2060. I'm assuming that's going to be based on the fact that they'll implement these policy changes that we've been discussing. So just moving on to the second survey question, please. Again, it's a quick yes or no. We haven't discussed hydrogen in depth during this session, but it'd be really interesting to get your idea on if you think this is a viable push. A lot of regions, Middle East being one as well, Europe as well, is a huge part of their new Green Deal, are pushing forward for hydrogen and want to emerge as leaders in it. And arguably, Asia's got a very impressive foundation in renewables already. It's got a very impressive portfolio. Does it have the tools it needs to make this viable? So does Asia have the capacity to craft a hydrogen roadmap in 2021 and be a global market leader by 2030, yes or no? If we can see the answers, please. Excellent. Thank you for that. Mona Lisa, were you a yes or a no in the interest of divulging anonymity for the hydrogen roadmap?
I think I belong to the minority on that question.
You think it's not feasible? It's just too big a task with where we're at the moment.
I think so. I think so. Given also the continuing need to respond to COVID and all the emerging evolving situation with COVID, I think we can definitely, things are moving on. There is, for instance, in the Philippines, we have started the study on it, but I doubt if we will be able to complete it all the way to the point that there will be a policy that will come out of it within the year.
Trung, which group were you in for the hydrogen question? And do you think that 2030 is viable, or like Mona Lisa, do you think that really we're looking at another decade at least?
Yeah, I'm with Mona Lisa there. I don't think we will. We were helping the consortium in Europe to build one of the largest electrolyzer, 1 gigawatts. And they're starting that now to be able to do that in the next few years. If we're not there yet for Asia, like Europe, 2030 won't be achievable. Now, we do have a consortium in Singapore with various players, but that's still in the early stages. So unless they accelerate, I don't think we're going to be there.
Be interesting to see which region does win the race. Europe seems to have a very detailed 3-phase plan so far. It seems to be pushing ahead on that. And on the China net zero goal, Henry, where did you stand on that? Just a couple of comments, please, because unfortunately we're heading towards the end of our session. Where did you stand on China's goal?
Yeah, I think thanks, Michelle. I think this is a very important question. I think President Xi Jinping has been very clear in announcing that the China new carbon neutrality target of reaching carbon neutrality by 2060. A lot of details, and this is a very ambitious target, I think, as we all recognize globally. But I think it is very good for the world if China can achieve this. And a lot of details is still to be announced, but some of the ones that we have discussed with the G20, B20 experts and other international experts is on this point of hydrogen. I was recently invited by the UK House of Lords, Lord Howell, to speak at an international roundtable that he chaired on hydrogen. And China has announced now, after President Xi Jinping's speech, that hydrogen would be an important pathway for China to achieve net zero. And they are announcing very ambitious plans for hydrogen innovation. And a lot of innovations and international collaboration will need to be done on this. Let me give an example.
A brief one if you can, Henry, because we've only got a couple of minutes.
Certainly. I think for hydrogen to be viable, the experts forecasted that the production costs should be reduced by 80% by 2030. And you might think that's very ambitious, but that's exactly what we've done with international collaboration on renewables in wind and renewables. So I'm cautiously optimistic in this.
Exactly, as you say, we have seen that with other markets, with the renewables market. It took a while. I mean, we took a couple of decades, but once the momentum was there, those private incentives, as Trung and Mona Lisa and Dr. Zidane as well have picked upon, once they were there, things started to move a lot faster. So in terms of going back to our key question, which policies are needed this year, we have financial incentives, the cultural shift, support for private sector, especially when it comes to something like grid parity, more developed hydrogen policies, but overall with the umbrella of let's bring these blueprints, which are ambitious and huge steps within themselves, especially from a country like China. This is a huge step forward, and move on and make that a tangible reality later this year. Cautious optimism across the board. I think maybe seeing those huge steps this year is not going to be on everybody's schedule, but certainly in the next few years. So many thanks to all our speakers for their excellent insights. We have a lot to chew on. Thank you very, very much.